So on this night after Purim, the holiday where we are commanded to tell jokes, laugh, and even get so drunk that we cannot tell the difference between good and bad, many Jews are pondering a question that goes to the heart of the humor that this holiday is established to celebrate. When does a joke stop being funny and become instead offensive and even dangerous? Many in the Jewish community are debating this very question after a joke was told last week on Saturday Night Live by comedian Michael Che during the weekend update segment of the world-famous and most watched show. Che, in his character as a news anchor reporting on current events, challenged Israel's claim to success at vaccinating 50% of Israelis against COVID-19. He said, quoting, "Israel is reporting that they vaccinated half of their population," said Che, the show's co-head writer, "and I'm going to guess it's the Jewish half." That was the joke. To the uninformed listener, Che was implying falsely that Israel is only vaccinating Jews against COVID-19, when in fact, all of Israel's citizens, Jews and Palestinians alike, are being vaccinated. Jewish organizations angrily denounced the joke as anti-Semitic, noting that Israel was in fact vaccinating its Arab as well as Jewish citizens. But others noticed that the joke did point to a real problem: Israel's failure to vaccinate Palestinians in the West Bank who aren't Israeli citizens, but who are nevertheless under Israel's occupation. And still others raised the counter-argument that jokes aren't meant to be taken literally, and the people who are known for our humor, indeed, some citing this very holiday of Purim as a prime example, would do well to laugh along with others. Why can't the people who basically invented the joke take a joke? Some were said. Was the rhetorical question asked by many in and outside of our community. The incident raises serious questions. Are we Jews being overly sensitive? Doesn't our transition from a powerless people to a powerful people require us to develop a thicker skin and to recognize that with attention will always come criticism, not to speak of biting jokes and satirical political commentary? More substantively, assuming that we're not treating Palestinians, certainly on the West Bank, the same way we treat Israeli Jews and Palestinians, do we really have the right to be so outraged? As my teacher, Rabbi Donniel Hartman, observed, a joke which has a kernel of truth may hurt, but it is the kernel, not the joke, which is the issue. Judaism has a long tradition of worrying about the danger of words. We never accepted that dichotomy that sticks and stones are dangerous and words are not, that they would never hurt. Rather, in Judaism, we acknowledge that words can do great harm. Words, in fact, can kill. The Torah and later rabbinic writings make clear that the sin of lashon hara, of gossip and of speaking ill of another person, they are sins worse than murder in the eyes of many Talmudic scholars. Because where physical violence has a definitive end, the sin of gossip, of lies and hurtful speech can go on hurting and reoccurring and hurting again and again. In Judaism, words matter. It was through words that God created the heavens and the earth. Bereshit bara Elohim, the Torah begins. At the beginning, God spoke. And it is through words that human beings can crush a spirit and mortally wound a soul. Some of us know that personally. And still, there is a part of our tradition which says jokes are sacred. So much so that many Jewish jokes are so well known that we simply refer to them by their number, or with the shorthand of the punchline, like, it might lead to dancing, or a priest, a minister, and a rabbi walk into a bar. In Judaism, you don't censor jokes. That's deep in Jewish culture. Jewish humor is irreverent. And last night, we quite literally laughed in the face of our own death, and then we ate cookies shaped like our tormentor's hat. That's funny. That's dark. That's cathartic. That's Jewish humor. Indeed, it's the very example of gallows humor we might have invented. But maybe this joke crossed the line. Maybe when it is, as this was, a political joke told on the most important political satire show in America, a show that shaped the culture of a whole generation, my generation, and when this joke portrays Jews as racist and comes out during a coordinated and global campaign, the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divest, and Sanction movement, to portray the Jewish state as an apartheid state. And when the joke is based on an outright lie that Israel distinguishes between its Jewish citizens and its Arab citizens, which it does not with regard to the COVID vaccine, that what we are really dealing with is more than the warning of Jewish tradition to be mindful of your words, to watch your speech. Words can kill. When is a joke not funny? Perhaps it is when your most basic legitimacy as a people or as a race or a nation is being challenged. Now, let me be clear. When you talk about the Jews, let alone joke about Jews, there's a lot of baggage and landmines that come with us. When you accuse Jews or the Jewish state of discriminating against others, or of pushing to the head of the line, or of hoarding life-saving medicine, there are associations here that touch a deep Jewish nerve, of blood libels, of dual loyalties, and anti-Semitic tropes. Our Jewish antenna, they go up. And while we as Jews may be especially attuned to this kind of mischaracterization, in truth, every race, every culture, every nation has its red lines. I won't repeat the litany of offensive and over-the-line jokes that have been made about marginalized people, or the outright lies told about free and democratic nations, but they are well known to us, well known to others, and we also know well never to repeat them. The danger in Che's joke, which wasn't even really very sophisticated in its attempt at humor, is that it perpetuates an already rapidly spreading narrative that Israel is white supremacist, that Israel is racist, that Israel is apartheid. And the more these lies are repeated, the more they become accepted as truth. And we know that when something becomes a conceptual given in society, it's not clear how to effectively combat it, especially if you're on the defensive against it from the beginning. And so we draw hard lines and we say, do not cross here, because once you let them over that line, they are within the gates. In fact, Judaism speaks directly to Che's actions. In Proverbs chapter 26, verses 17 through 19, we are taught, and it's as though this was written for the moment. Someone who passes by and gets involved in a conflict that is not their own is like one who grabs a dog by the ears, like a madman who casts firebrands and arrows and death. That's the person who deceives their neighbor and says, "But I was just joking." That's the quote from Proverbs, from Mishle, written thousands of years ago. What Che did in articulating this joke based on an outright lie and fallacy was to cut into a conflict that was not his own. And he clearly knows nothing about and that caused undeserved pain, like grabbing a dog by its ears. He opened up a hornet's nest and then, like the text, shirks any responsibility by saying, "I was only joking." That said, let's be rational and not hysterical. Not every person who makes a joke about Jews is an enemy or an anti-Semite. Michael Che is not part of a larger cabal against the Jewish people. But his joke fed a lie and targeted a long persecuted people, us, the Jewish people. That was wrong and that was hurtful. There's no doubt that Che's argument is factually incorrect. 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinian Arabs. And all Israeli citizens, like in Canada, are members of the National Health Plan. And everybody has access to the vaccine, not like in Canada, and is being vaccinated. But the joke may be a little painful because it's pointing to something that we could have done, should have done. As Rabbi Hartman pointed out, it's not the joke that hurts. It's the kernel of truth within the joke that touches a nerve. The critique of Israel in relation to COVID-19 and the Palestinians is based on two aspects. One is legal, and the other is moral. The legal actually has very little weight. The Oslo Accords grant full autonomy to the Palestinians on health matters. The Palestinian Authority, in the past, made it clear to Israel that they did not want Israeli intervention or help in their public health system, and they made it explicitly clear with regard to COVID-19. The moral argument begins with the first moral responsibility that any state has, and that is a moral responsibility to its own citizens, And Israel is still in the process of fulfilling its moral responsibility to vaccinate its own citizens, Jews and non-Jews alike. But at now 70, almost 75% of Israel approaching the point where they're about to fulfill that moral responsibility because they're about to all become vaccinated. And then what? What is the moral responsibility in a global pandemic for Israel to those living in lands occupied by Israel? In Judaism, in the Judaism as I practice it and as I teach it, the legal does not excuse me from the moral responsibility. Even in strict orthodoxy, we are commanded to have empathy for others, to live by the words of Torah, b'chai b'chem, not to let them be the end of us. Morality takes precedent. It is moral and legal for Israel to first care for its own citizens, Jew and non-Jew alike, and without distinction. And Israel is doing that better than any other country in the world. But it is also moral that Israel, when it can, and that time appears to be soon at hand, turn its resources to those that it is also has a moral responsibility for, those who live under Israeli occupation. Israel is now vaccinating the youngest adults in its population. It could have, under the moral question, for example, decided to offer vaccine and resources to acquire vaccine to the Palestinians once Israel had vaccinated, let's say, those that were 60 or over, knowing that those in the younger age cohorts are less likely to experience hospitalization and death. It could have said to the Palestinians, now, here, if you haven't already started vaccinating those 60 and older in your population, as we have done, then please take these shots or these resources, and then we'll work back and forth on the age groups down the ladder. Part of Israel's role as a global leader and an exemplar of a social democracy is a willingness to be judged by the highest moral standards amongst the community of nations. And as a Jewish state, Israel must accept that the Jewish nation, just like the Jewish people, is held to and answers to a higher authority and a higher standard. Shay's joke was factually wrong, and Israel is in the unique position now to do more for the Palestinians than it has done thus far. I would prefer that the Jewish people went beyond the legal and set a new standard of moral ethical behavior for all nations and all people. I think that's our calling as an Or LaGoyim, to be a light unto the nations, as our Torah teaches. You know, people laugh at Canadians for being too nice. That's a Canadian joke. Imagine a world where they laugh at the Jewish people and the Jewish state for being too moral, too empathic, too generous. For me, that's no joke. It's an aspiration. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may it be God's will. Amen.